Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 22, season 2. Apologies for my voice this week. I've got a bit of a cold, but I've also got the legendary Helen Atthowe on the podcast for you this week. Helen has an amazing story, and we kind of get the full arc in this conversation from her time in Montana at Biodesign Farm, how she studied under Masanobu Fukuoka for a little bit, and then she had 2 more farms with her husband, the late, great Carl Rosado, whose work we get to celebrate a little bit here. A lot of Helen's own work is in strip tillage, but she and Carl also did some cool strip no-tillage studies, which I was really interested in. It's just an amazing conversation, and I really loved chatting with Helen. Also, when we spoke, she mentioned looking for someone who wants to learn about no-till organic orchard production and minimal-till vegetable and high-tunnel production. If you're interested and you want to go help Helen, you can find more information at woodleaffarm.org. We talk a little bit about that at the end, so just want to throw that out there. Of course, I could not do this podcast without the help of our amazing show sponsors like Growing for Market magazine.
Hi, I'm Andrew Mefford, editor of Growing for Market magazine. We're excited to be back sponsoring the No-Till Market Garden podcast, so we made a code for listeners to get 25% off any subscription. Head on over to growingformarket.com and enter the code WORM, that's W-O-R-M, for the discount. We're still on the same mission as when the flower farmer author Lynn Basinski founded the magazine 29 years ago, to be a resource written by farmers for farmers with practical ideas and information to help local farms succeed. There are a decade of back issues and articles available online, plus subscribers automatically get 20% off any of the books we sell, including the No-Till book bundle of 3 no-till books listed together at 10% off the cover price, so you can add your subscriber discount and get a total of 30% off the price of all 3. If you do farmers markets, farm stands, CSA, local wholesaling, dream of starting a no-till farm, or a little of everything, if you like what you're hearing on the podcast, go to Growing for Market and use the code WORM for 25% off any subscription.
Today's show is also brought to you by BCS America.
BCS two-wheeled tractors are often referred to as the best tiller on earth, which makes sense given that the rear tine tiller is our most popular attachment. Recently, a growing number of folks have begun to see till as a dirty word. No-till and low-till methods certainly have their benefits, but the BCS tiller attachment has a new trick up its sleeve for growers that are concerned with inverting soil layers or over-pulverizing their soil. The Precision Depth Roller accessory, or PDR, is now available for 30-inch BCS tillers, and a 26-inch version will be available in early 2020. The PDR gives BCS owners precise control over the depth at which they engage their soil, from half an inch up to 7 inches deep in half-inch increments, perfect for mixing in soil amendments while chopping up any leftover plant residues. And the PDR's expanded mesh roller gently levels the soil, leaving behind a perfect seedbed. The PDR is on sale now. Check out bcsamerica.com for sale pricing and to find your nearest dealer.
All right, big thanks to our show sponsors, and enough from me. Let's get to this amazing interview with Helen Atthowe of Woodleaf Farm. Helen Atthowe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm super excited to have you on. I think some of the systems that you've been using are really interesting, and I'm excited to kind of dive into your work a bit. I thought we could start with you just giving us a sort of brief overview of your farming career. Where did it start, and especially kind of where did your more regenerative practices come into play?
You bet. Well, I was lucky enough to grow up in Montana, so I learned to farm more conventionally with cattle ranchers, actually, in western Montana. And then I went off to college and graduate school and became interested in horticulture and plant physiology and agricultural ecology, and studied academically. And then the best luck was that between my undergraduate and graduate school, I managed to escape. Well, I quit, and for a while I just went and farmed, and I found a place in northeast Georgia where they were doing natural farming, and ended up, there was a Japanese man that was running the place and using Masanobu Fukuoka's methods. And then several of us over time got to go to Japan and study with Masanobu Fukuoka. So that was probably my starting to get excited about regenerative or alternative, or what I like to call ecological agricultural methods. And then I went back and finished graduate school with a lot of excitement and wanted to really focus on organic and ecological agriculture. And started working I worked for the university, but I had clients that were part of our integrated pest management program that wanted to try a little more innovative approaches. And one of the farmers eventually hired me full time to convert his 200, I can't remember exactly how many acres. It was a little over 200 acres of vegetable and fruit crops from an integrated pest management, but conventional IPM management to certified organic in 1 year. And being young and stupid, I said, sure, we can do that, no problem. And he was selling, that was, I learned a lot that year. And he was selling in New York City, direct market at all of the farmers markets in New York City, including, before it disappeared, the World Trade Center market. So we went with peaches and apples and all vegetable crops, and we had some great successes, some great learning, and some spectacular failures. And the ones that were successful are kind of the ones that I ended up building on in my own career. When I finally moved back to Montana, moved home to where my parents had land, and I bought a little farm and started the farm that I worked on and did most of my experimenting on, called Biodesign Farm. That's a long answer to that question.
No, that's a great answer to that question. I'm interested in hearing a little bit about what it was like to go study with Fukuoka. I think a lot of people may not realize he just passed away in only 10 years, 2008. I think it was like 2008, maybe. And that he
lived to a ripe old age.
He did. So I'm curious, like, what it was like to go out there and study with him.
Well, I had studied for a year with another Japanese man who had studied with him, called Mikio Suzuki, and I had learned a lot of the techniques, and I'd gotten used to. I'm not even sure how to explain it, to the Japanese approach, which is a much quieter watch and listen approach. So I was not there for very long, but I felt able to watch and listen better than I might have if I just gone straight from, God forbid, straight from college and graduate school, where we were focused so much on learning facts. And Fukuoka was definitely not as focused on facts. And I was always wanting to know how systems worked biologically. And so I learned to listen and listen to the land quite a bit there.
So so you're returning back to Montana, and you've just bought this little piece of land. Can you describe that land a little bit?
Sure. I bought a farm that had been in cattle and sheep production for many years. It was an older place, and it was marginal farmland. It was in pasture, and it was not particularly fertile, and it was considered relatively marginal, a low USDA grade soil and very, very rocky. So I found, I started out in the least rocky field and did my first tillage and then planted a cover crop of white clover, and then I just started modifying what I learned at Masanobu Fukuoka's and putting in a little of what I had learned in college and graduate school, and developed a system that relied on once a year tillage of that, what we called the living mulch. And at that time, I was what I call a nitrogen monger. I was a nitrogen farmer and did a lot of calculating and figured out how what I added would translate into crop production and how much I needed to replace to pull off the amount of crop yield that I wanted. So I went back to my more traditional graduate school, agricultural school way of thinking, but also with the living mulches and trying to figure out how to have, instead of adding nutrients every year, how I could also get some nutrient cycling going on. So we would do strip tillage, just really lightly. Actually, strip tillage is the wrong word. I moved to strip tillage. We did a light tillage and left a lot of residue on the surface, so much residue that my neighbors would go by and say, just when I was about ready to make the beds and plant, they would say, when are you going to start working your fields up? Because there was so much residue left. And then I would make the raised beds and plant clover seed in the row middles. And that system worked really well. And again, learning to watch and listen, I realized that this living mulch system where the row middles were covered with clover from, by the time I would seed every year, I would till and then make the beds and then seed the living mulches, and the living mulches would be covered by late spring. They would cover the soil, and then I would leave the living mulch on the soil surface until the next spring, so that over winter the soil was completely covered. And I learned that created overwintering sites for some of the resident beneficial insects that then didn't have to move in every year. They were already there. Spiders, many species of spiders, and ground beetles, carabid beetles, and rove beetles, and the habitat of the living mulch over the spring and summer and fall also created pollen and nectar and seed sources for above ground beneficial insects like parasitic wasps and predaceous stink beetles and all kinds of fly aphid predators and the ones everyone knows, ladybugs and lacewings and minute pirate bugs. We had this huge increase in beneficial insects. And so I had been mowing the living mulch to initiate and encourage nutrient cycling, just like leaves will fall into the forest and decompose. My theory was that I would mow the living mulch every time it got to be 10 inches to 12 inches, and then it would slowly go back and decompose and grow again, and that's how we got it. We got our added fertilizer, our side dressing, so to speak, of fertilizer by having that mowing. And the other thing, too, that did is that sometimes, actually pretty regularly in the early years, the first 5 to 8 years, we had a lot of annual weeds growing back up through the clover, and I learned that if I mowed them, the clover liked the mowing, and the annual weeds did not, and over time I diminished significantly population of annual weeds. And gosh, after 10 to 12 years, we just really didn't see that many annual weeds anymore. So we mowed for all those reasons, and we tried to do selective mowing so that we could have climate modification for the crops early in the spring, higher living mulches to keep the wind off the young seedlings and the early transplants, and let the living mulch bloom so that it would provide habitat for beneficial insects and predators, and then mow it and not mow it all at once. So I started mowing every other row middle and then leaving some habitat for the beneficial insects. And over time, we just got to the point where we tried to leave certain rows of the living mulch untilled, so that we would leave these islands of habitat for beneficial insects and not till the whole field. So I guess the summary there is that the system started out with just something to put down between the row middles, mainly for nutrient cycling, and then as we watched the system, we realized that we were getting incredible biological control, and we were able to stop spraying certified organic insecticides like soap or gosh, I can't even remember what we used to spray, pyrethrin for some of the insects, and then we stopped by 2000. We stopped spraying anything at all. The system was, we started in 1992, by the way. So by after 8 years, we basically stopped spraying any certified organic insecticides, and we're getting entirely acceptable yields and excellent quality. So after we started leaving the islands of beneficial insect habitat, the untilled living mulch rows, maybe we would leave one row for every 10 rows and just till around that. We finally got to be brave enough and decided we can do less tillage. And after, let's see, I guess it was 2005, we started moving and preparing another field, a pasture that had been in pasture and kind of ignored, not really done much with. I'd gotten a crop of hay off of it every year and grazed horses on it, but I hadn't done anything else. So in 2005, I tilled that whole field up and planted red clover and triticale, and the field came back almost 100% red clover and just looked like something out of The Wizard of Oz. It was so beautiful and solid and green, and I said, okay, this shows me that we can get away with trying to do no-till row middles, and let's see what we can get away with. So in 2006, we just strip-tilled where the beds were going to be with a 3-foot tiller. We will strip-till the beds and then mow the living mulch row middles, which were about 4 foot, because that was the size of my little tractor and mower that could fit in between. And I'd mowed them and threw the clover into the into the crop rows, and then I would put plastic mulch on for the crops that needed a warmer soil, like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, and I would just do the one tillage pass and then put the plastic mulch on, and then all of that residue would decompose over the season underneath the plastic and feed the transplants that I put in, the tomatoes and peppers and eggplant transplants. And then the other rows, I would till the clover in that I had mowed onto the beds at least one more time. And for small seeded crops like carrots, I would sometimes do a third pass just to make a fine seed bed for the for the little seeded crops, which I never did very well. I'm a pretty terrible carrot grower, by the way, so I focused on what I did well, and just grew small amounts of the challenging crops. Although we did very well with seeded lettuces and salad mixes, so maybe it was just the thinning of the carrots that I objected to. I had spent too much time with Masanobu Fukuoka and wasn't very good at doing our traditional horticulture thinning. So we moved to this system where we had living mulches that were never tilled, so 4-foot row middles that were perennial red clover. And as those of you who have worked with red clover know, it's a perennial, and it's a very aggressive perennial. It was great. It just couldn't be better for keeping weed pressure down. We never had any of those annual weed problems in this red clover that we'd had with the white clover early on when I was tilling the field every year and then planting the white clover living mulches. But what we did have is we had the red clover moving back into the crop row. And so our main weed became our living mulch. But we, over time, realized that if we just could suppress the red clover at certain times, by the end of the year, we were kind of glad to have the red clover move back into the row, and that it allowed us a living mulch to then strip till in, or a cover crop, so to speak, to then strip till in the next season, and our soil was completely covered because of that lovely, aggressive rhizomatous red clover. And so that was the system in, I guess, let's see, that was 2006 to 2010, and I sold the farm in 2010 and moved down to California to farm with my husband in the Sierra foothills of California.
That's great. So you basically just kept answering all of the questions that I had because and it was, which is great, and it was so interesting. There were so many things that you said there that I really loved, like one about the red clover sort of creeping back into the bed at the end of the season. I think that's super interesting, this idea of like a cover crop that kind of just replants itself.
Yes, and I want to just jump on that point because, of course, in the first 12 years of my farming, I had a cost of seed, right? I had to buy new seed and seed it every year. In what we call the new field, I never had to seed again.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. So you had 4-foot pathways essentially, which the crop middles, as you called them. And then you had, how wide were the beds? They were 3 foot wide. Is that what you said the tiller was?
Right. I had a little tiller. It was kind of based on my equipment. I had a little tiller that was 3 foot wide, and I had a little Yanmar tractor and a little a rotary mower that were 4 foot wide. So the beds were as wide as the tiller, and the row middles were as high as wide as the mower, because I managed it all with basically 2 pieces of equipment.
Yeah, that's amazing. So a couple more things, just because I'm thinking about this in Montana. You were able to do this out in the field and have ripe tomatoes, ripe peppers, ripe eggplant, all of those things in Montana.
And I'm glad that you're impressed. That it isn't saying much, but at the time I was the largest field-grown tomato producer in Montana. Again, it wasn't saying much, but most people produce tomatoes in greenhouses and high tunnels. But the reason I think we were able to get away with that, there were 2. One is that, remember I said we did use the black plastic mulch, and I felt badly about that because the plastic is obviously an unsustainable, unecological approach. But at that time, I've since figured out another approach, but at that time I couldn't figure out how to warm the soil and still get a commercial yield. So yes, we used black plastic, and then we also used, as soon as I planted, we would cover the plants with wire hoops, and then with an agribon, a remay kind of product. And we learned that we could leave the remay on for 3 to 5 weeks, and that not only did we have frost protection and warmth, but we learned something, at least with our solanaceous crops, that we got better root development with the shading, that we got this vegetative and root growth, and it was like, things that grow in the tropics. They just liked, or the Northeast, how you get that incredible vegetative growth, and that then when we slowly took the agribond off, the crops were much farther along than they would have been if we hadn't put the agribon or the remay on. So we utilized fabric, and then we utilized the black plastic. And yes, I did try some peppers as I got more brave and had been making enough money that I could make more mistakes. Later on, I tried peppers on raised beds, but without the plastic. And the raised beds slowed the red clover movement back into the bed just a little bit, enough so that we could get some establishment of the red peppers. And the yields were still pretty good on the red peppers, but we got red peppers 2 to 3 weeks later than we did with the peppers on the black plastic. And some years that was not a huge financial detriment, and some years you made so much money on those first red peppers that it was a huge financial hit to start production 2 to 3 weeks later.
And can you kind of venture a guess as to how much land, because it's kind of hard because so much of it was mowed. Can you say about how much land was in cultivation there?
That's a really good question. I mean, I can certainly tell you how much acreage was. We had the old field was a 2-acre field, and the new field was a 6-acre field. But you'd have to say that the rows were much closer together in the 2-acre field. So I'd say I used a hand mower, a little BCS push mower, because the rows were so close. They were probably 3-foot beds and 1 to 2 foot row middles. But I'm going to say that we were probably doing 1.5 acres of vegetables on the old field, and you're going to have to say 50% was in clover. So we were probably doing out of 6, we were probably doing 3 acres of vegetables when we went to the system with the wider living mulches. But one thing I did want to mention, with this method of strip tilling the overwintering clover and weeds, thank goodness we got weeds too, because they were full of nutrients in the crop row, and then mowing the red clover and tilling that in, we had and then making raised beds, of course, we had almost what would be an intensive raised bed method. Obviously not quite. We weren't double digging or, doing any of the Jevons techniques or the French intensive biodynamic approaches, but we were still concentrating nutrients in a 3-foot bed. So all of that is to say that the yields were extremely concentrated and very high in those beds, which of course didn't make up for entirely. Sometimes it did because the yields were so high, but with those 4-foot beds, of course, our per acre yield was probably lower than, well, it's certainly lower than it would have been if we'd done, a more conventional field pattern without leaving the living mulches in between. But not as low as I would have expected, because we got over yielding in the concentrated bed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's neat. So one thing that you mentioned there that I kind of want to just touch on for a second is the weeds and the nutrients. And one of the videos I saw, you talked about the ability of mallow to fix nitrogen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so mallow doesn't fix nitrogen. It doesn't. It's not. It doesn't have, that we know of course. But I'm going to say science is pretty good on this. That there's not a rhizobium or a frankia, or there's no bacterial interaction between mallow and a nitrogen fixer. So it's not a traditional nitrogen fixer. But what it is a nitrogen accumulator. And it took me a while to figure this out. In the old field, where, remember, we were tilling every year and then seeding the the white clover. Actually, we tried several things. We did Parabinga medic, we did snail medic, we did lentils, we did white clover and yellow sweet clover, all site clover. We tried a whole bunch of things that we seeded, because we seeded every year. But as I disturbed the soil every year and did the same ecological thing every year for a while, I would till in the spring, and then I would seed the clover, and then I would mow. I developed weeds that liked that kind of ecological approach, and one of them was mallow, Malva neglecta, common mallow. Just really loved the same thing that the clover did. It liked to be low growing, and it liked to be mowed. And then over time, as the soil fertility built up, and not only did it build up in the first couple of years, but I started in 92, and by 1996, I had excessive levels of nitrate, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So excessive that I had to change my farming system. The nutrient levels were too high, and I started seeing such high nitrogen levels. At one point, my spring nitrate nitrogen, I think it was in 1996, was 100 parts per million. So I started that year, I started seeing blossom end rot on the tomatoes at a little higher level than I had previously, and I felt that I was getting antagonism with between that excessive nitrogen and calcium magnesium levels. So I had to reassess, and I backed off and stopped, decreased, and then stopped altogether applying compost, and began to rely more on the living mulch fertility contribution. With the excessive nutrients over time in the old field, we also noticed a change in the vegetation, and we started seeing more weeds, and particularly the weeds that like the same ecological habitat that the clover liked, which was a mowing and a tillage once a year. And that common mallow, the Malva neglecta, became very, very dominant. I have pictures of Malva neglecta, or the common mallow, being almost my entire ground cover in certain areas. And of course, my neighbors noticed and would tell me that I was just making a weedy field, and I felt badly, but it wasn't actually getting in my way, and the soil fertility was still really good. So I talked to a brilliant soil fertility person, Robert Parnes, who wrote the book Fertile Soil, and he sent me some data, which is in one of the later versions of his book, Fertile Soil, on the contributions of of weeds. And I looked up, and sure enough, actually he had Malva rotunda folia. He had a different mallow, but a cousin of my mallow weed, and it was contributing 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And I looked at it and I said, my God, this plant is accumulating, and every time I till it, adding back to the soil. And that was the first germ of an idea that has now been the basis of our entire system on our new farm in Oregon, which is not only are we cycling nutrients as we use cover crops and living mulches, but if we really do it right, we're recycling nutrients. We're using plants and their biomass to accumulate nutrients in the soil, and then as we mow and as we strip till, we're recycling those nutrients back. And this was really important because we decided that maybe we could use on our Oregon farm, we decided that we could use no off-farm fertilizer and only use what we grew on farm, and we moved to a system of totally using grow your own fertilizer. But in Montana, I hadn't gotten that brave or creative yet, and we were still learning the lessons that Fukuoka taught us, which is to watch nature and just barely getting the ideas. But that mallow, that common mallow, was the first idea for me that, wow, we could get things that would just accumulate nutrients and then recycle them back to the soil.
Yeah, that's great. I think that we're just now kind of touching the surface of how to really utilize living plants around crops. And I think that's like a really, really beautiful way of putting it. Hey, you all, one quick interruption for me this week to say that if you enjoy our work and you want to see it keep going, consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/farmerjesse, where at certain levels you get a shout out on the show, regardless of whether or not I have a cold. So big shout out this week to J.M. Fortier, Kevin Keene, Ryan Gosser, Tiffany Jackson, Weaver Akers, William Henpin, Yannick LaPlante, Melissa Smith, D. Stradsgotenbuer. I have no idea if I said that right, but thank you, and Matthew Finekind. All right, back to Helen. So you moved to Northern California. Can you tell us a little bit about that farm and how you kind of incorporated those new ideas?
Yes, I met my husband at the Eco Farm conference. He was presenting his work and his system using living mulches. He had an entirely no-till system in his orchard, did a little minimum till when he did some vegetable production, and I thought it was brilliant. So I asked all kinds of questions, and the next day he came to my presentation on my living mulch system, and eventually I sold my farm and moved in to help him with his farm. And we went, with the two of us, egging each other on and helping each other. We went to even wilder habitat creation. We got to the point where we would only mow selectively, and we would let, in the spring, the orchard just go entirely crazy and wild. And we found that the same thing happened even with his orchard system. We were able to, that was, I moved in 2011, 2012. By 2013, we had really decreased, and by 2014, we stopped any certified organic insecticide spray. So we were able to create in field, right next to the crop, biological control for the terrible codling moth, which causes wormy apples, and nobody wants to find a worm in their apple, and peach pest as well. So we were able to basically emulate what occurred at my farm in Montana in a much higher pressure system in California and still get high yields and acceptable, not entirely 100% clean, but acceptable fruit quality without any spraying, which was extremely exciting to us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really neat.
So I guess I should explain that system a little bit. So Woodleaf Farm in California was 26 acres and 8 acres in tree fruit production, and the fields were 1 to 2 acre. There were 7 1 to 2 acre fields, and they were separated by native oak and pine forest corridors, so that we had smaller fields separated by wilder areas, and then the fields themselves were all on the contour on slight to pretty good slopes, and in between was a grass and weed and clover living mulch that was, of course, a perennial living mulch. And Carl, unlike me, was a much braver soil fertility manager, and he didn't feel the need to be a nitrogen monger, and he introduced me to the concept of carbon farming, to focusing on building high carbon in the soil and then allowing the nutrients to be released from your carbon framework, your organic matter framework. And at first I didn't believe him, but our yields were very good, and we began to experiment more and more with a high carbon system. And not only did it ultimately seem to work with the perennial crops, the tree fruit crops, we began to slowly move into a high carbon system with our annual crops as well.
So what did that look like in practice in terms of how did that differ from what you were doing?
So in Montana, I had made a compost with manure and clover and straw. And of course, manure being the turbojet high nitrogen application for annual crops. And on Carl's farm, the only nitrogen off-farm fertilization that he applied was a yard waste compost, so composted wood bark, branches, and leaves. And so it was a much lower nitrogen than the compost and clover and straw compost that I had done. And so we used that a little bit on the orchard and also we used it on the peaches, not on the apples. And we used it on the small areas of the orchard that we would put into vegetable production. And we did very little vegetable production, but we did these wonderful long Asian cucumbers on a trellis. And we did, of course, once I moved there, we did peppers and tomatoes. But we probably had all together on the whole place in little pockets where old trees came out and we would do some tillage. We probably had just barely an acre of vegetables.
Okay, that's great. All right, so then at what point did you move up to Oregon then?
So we had 2013, 14, and 15, we had just unbelievably bountiful and lucrative years. We had excellent yields and excellent quality, and with 2 of us working the farm and our labor-saving approaches, we didn't have much labor for the farm, so it was just the 2 of us and one other full-time fellow who worked like us, really, really long hours. So when I say he was one full-time person all of us worked more like 70 to 80 hours a week than what some people might consider full-time, but basically just 3 people running the farm and a little bit of help with fruit packing and some other people helping at farmers markets. We did 7 farmers markets in the Bay Area per week. With all of those 3 lucrative years, bountiful years, and very little put costs and very little labor costs, we made so much money we said, we could probably be close to early retirement here. And especially I had sold my farm, and if we sell the farm at Woodleaf, so we went on a backpacking and camping trip and looked for land. And Carl had found a place in eastern Oregon where there was lots of wild space and lots of water, and it looks like it was low enough to grow peaches. And when we came into the valley, we were just so entranced by all of this wild fruit growing everywhere along the rivers and the irrigation ditches. There were wild plums and wild apricots and apples, and we said, this is a fruit grower's paradise. So we found a farm at the end of 2015 and bought it in December and moved in March 1st, 2016, and started planting a new orchard and put up greenhouses and high tunnels and started a new vegetable field. And we went from a 26-acre farm to a 211-acre farm for retirement. But fortunately, that was supposed to be funny. And most of it, however, was in wildland. But still, there were 70 irrigated acres along a mile of this beautiful creek, Eagle Creek, and it had been in pasture for over 50 years. But it had been, for the last 15 years, it had been hayed two crops a year and grazed only enough to utilize the hay that was put up on the place, but fertility hadn't been maintained except nitrogen, phosphorus. They had added, conventional fertilizer, chemical fertilizer to keep the hay yields up. And so while the soil texture and quality and general fertility was good, the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium levels were pretty low because they'd been doing just the opposite of what we'd been doing, building up a carbon structure, an organic matter system. They were just, basically giving chemical fertilizer to get a crop. So we had, for our system, low fertility soil, even though it was the most fertile soil that we had ever started with in our farming practices. So we weren't sure what we could get away with, but we wanted to see if we could utilize all the techniques, the carbon farming techniques that we had developed, and see if we could just grow our own fertilizer and not bring in off-farm fertilizer, and if we could go to no-till on the orchard. So the first few trees we put in, we strip-tilled, just the way I had done in the later stages of my farming at Biodesign Farm in Montana. And we just took that 50-year-old pasture and we mowed it down, and then we strip-tilled with that same 3-foot tiller, 3-foot beds for our trees, and we planted them. And then I seeded clover, but to be honest, the hay moved itself back in, and it was mainly grasses and alfalfa and clover. And I experimented with some beneficial insect and pollinator mixes, but to be honest, what came naturally in the end seemed to work the best, and which of course gave us the same system of not having to ever reseed again. So we we did that with the first trees that we planted, and then where we were able to prepare ahead of time, we mowed and got hay, or what we called green chop, from our property, and we put it down, I think it was about 30 pounds of green chop or hay on every hole where the tree was going to go the next spring, and then we were able to pull that back, and we had set the pasture, the 50-year-old pasture, back enough that we were able to plant a tree directly into that. So most of the field got strip-tilled, and some of it was no-till. Out of 600 trees, about 200 trees were no-till, and they're doing great. And the minimum till trees are probably the best fruit trees I have ever seen or grown.
Interesting. So
I'll have to send you photographs. Yeah, we had just wonderful yields and quality, and again, no spraying. Oh, but I do need to add one thing that we did. So Carl, unlike me, who was a nitrogen monger, Carl did mineral balancing, and so he had studied with Neil Kinsey and was a big believer in mineral balancing with micronutrients and with calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. So he did that in the Woodleaf farm in California. When we moved to Oregon, the deal was that I was going to be brave, and we were just going to use plant-based, high-carbon fertilizer, that I didn't need any turbojet, high-nitrogen manure fertilizer, but that he was going to figure out how to use less of the minerals, because, of course, the minerals are mined from somebody else's land to then be brought to our land, and I had seen limestone and phosphate mining in Idaho and in British Columbia, and I just felt that we needed to be more sustainable than that, and Carl agreed. So we mixed up minerals, and he put them down right underneath that hay mulch, or where we did the strip tilling, just around every tree hole. So instead of mineralizing the whole field, we just mineralized where the tree was, and then the idea being that anything that was not in balance, if we did it that one time in that one place, perhaps we could introduce it to the system, and we would see if our recycling would work with the micronutrients and the phosphorus and magnesium. We already had very high calcium levels in the soil in the farm in Oregon, so we didn't have to balance that well. But the idea was to see how far we could push the envelope with mineral balancing and mineral recycling, as well as the big three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium recycling. And so we did that experiment.
I love that. Yeah, that's a super, especially in something like an orchard where you don't necessarily need it on every square foot. That makes a lot of sense. Not only can it save you money, but ecologically and just sustainability thinking, that's got to take some pressure off. I want to hear about this 4-year study that you did at this farm. You sent me this PDF.
Yeah.
I think is really cool. Can I share that? Do you mind if I share that with people, or is that proprietary?
Yes, you're very welcome to do that. So the same thing. Remember, we're semi-retired on this farm, and we 600 trees instead of 3,000 trees.
Exactly.
Did seem like retirement, but it wasn't what a lot of people would consider retirement. But what was retirement was we got to really push our ideas and see how far we could go, because we were not as tied financially to making a living. So we could have failures. And I do need to tell you, the first year we planted our dried beans. We grow, we also really like heirloom dried beans, and we thought at one point we would grow that as a crop, but we were certainly growing them for our own, trying to grow all our own food. So we put in black turtle beans and cranberry beans and Floriani red flint corn, and we did the strip tillage, remember, on this low fertility soil, well, high fertility soil, a beautiful deep loam, river bottom soil, for goodness sake, but that had been used as it had been chemical fertilizer and not any organic matter. The organic matter was low when we started. It was around 2%, 2.5%. So we did the strip tillage, and we didn't add any fertilizer. We said, okay, let's see if we can just add the tilled-in pasture and then use our living mulches and blow it into the crop. And what we got with the first 2016 beans and corn and some of the vegetables is that we got nitrogen and phosphorus and mobilization, and we got some kind of yellowy-looking crops the first couple of weeks, and they eventually grew out of it, and the yields on the beans were good but not great, and the yield on the corn was pretty meager. You would have been, if you were trying to make a living on it, it would have been a disaster. And so we looked at that and we said, maybe just adding the tilled-in field and the living mulch isn't enough. So we started adding green chop, which is the hay that was cut on another part of the farm or close to where we were going to do the vegetable rows, and then put on in the fall, let decompose, and then tilled in the spring. And by 2017, we had better vegetable yields and not so much a slow start in the spring. But that led us to the experiment, and we said, well, what can we get away with? We're trying not to bring in off-farm fertilizer, and we have the living mulch. If we do the strip tillage, we have the living mulch in the row middles blown into the crop row, and we also have our green chop, our hay from other parts of the farm. Let's set up an experiment comparing both of those. So in the fall or late summer of 2017, we set up basically two fertilizer treatments to compare. One where we had ridiculously wide 10-foot row middles and 4-foot crop rows, and then we would mow the living mulch from either side into the crop row, and that would be our fertility. And then the other fertility system, we called it Fertility System 2, we would put on 4 inches of hay mulch along with the living mulch mowings and test that against the living mulch. And so we let the hay mulch and the living mulch just sit all winter and tilled them in the spring of 2018 and started the first year on 4 rows. We had 4 long rows with several replications of each treatment in each row, and we had a rotation of one row was cabbage and onions, the second row was red bell peppers, the third row was beans, and the fourth row was supposed to be corn, but that got changed to a second row of heirloom beans when Carl had a terrible accident and I had to do the experiment by myself. I just couldn't get it together to do the corn too. So we had what had been planned to be a 4-year rotation with 4 rows, and the 4 different crops moving to different rows over the 4 years, and then the 2 soil fertility systems would be in permanent plots, of course, in each of the rows. So So that was the basic design, and the first year I was only able to collect data on the black beans and the cranberry beans, the heirloom dried beans, and there wasn't much difference, although there was a little higher yield in the plots with the extra 4 inches of hay mulch added and tilled in the spring. And then the second year in 2019, again, not too much difference among the dried beans. And the red cabbage, which I'll have to send you, maybe you have photographs, yeah. The photographs of the yields from 2019, the cabbage was just gorgeous. And again, not too much difference between the two soil fertility systems, the mulch, the living mulch only and the living mulch plus added hay mulch. But the red peppers had a huge difference, almost double the yield of red bell peppers in the plots that received the extra 4 inches. So far into this experiment, it looks like some crops, some of the heavy feeder crops, need that extra added mulch, and some of them can get away with several mowings a year into the crop row of just the living mulch, as long as you provide enough area so that you have enough volume to keep mowing into the crop. And Carl did some calculations. We tested what the nutrient content of the living mulch and the hay mulch or the green chop was, and we also then got the dried material and weighed it up and calculated how much we were adding. And I'm not entirely comfortable with those numbers yet, but on where we had those wide rows, the 15-foot of row middle, Carl calculated that we were probably adding about 400 pounds. If you did it that way, you would get, and you extrapolate it out, you get about 400 pounds per acre, so about 2 tons of hay added per acre. And again, I'm not real comfortable with those numbers, but I think the numbers are higher than I would have thought. And so 2 tons per acre doesn't seem entirely unreasonable if you have enough area and you're mowing it regularly throughout the season. And then, of course, the other benefits of the system we found in this experiment was not just nutrient cycling and recycling, but also we had the same habitat for beneficial insects. We tried to do selective mowing and leave things flowering as much as we could. And then the undisturbed no-till area where we had habitat for spiders and ground beetles. And in Oregon, we found out we also had habitat for lots of snakes, all of which were beneficial to our crops, and some of which made me a little nervous, but I'm learning to go back to what Masanobu Fukuoka said, which was farming is an unconditional effort to keep all things alive and growing, and so all things, even the snakes, got to be alive and growing.
Right.
And yeah, and then the other thing, just by kind of accident, we realized is when we applied a lot of the living mulch mowed into the row, and Carl fashioned our little Husqvarna mower so that it was easier to blow all of it into the crop row, that we had, a little bit of hay mulch that also helped us with weed management. So the good news is that because Carl was injured and unable to help farm for a year and a half, that I ran basically 3/4 of an acre of vegetables with 10 300-foot rows of vegetables entirely by myself with no other labor at all, which really showed me that in some ways it's not how much you yield overall, but how much you end up getting back. So it's the input costs as well. If you can really limit your input costs, then your productivity is measured in an entirely different way, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's great. So if you were going to kind of design, like, let's just take a step back and we talked about that whole that whole study. So from the very beginning, you start a garden, and then what are like the first steps to get it to that point that it's so manageable, like you said, with one person? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think it's going to depend, of course, on your climate and your conditions, your water availability, your soil type, your soil fertility that you're moving into, whether or not you have recalcitrant weed problems that you go into, just all of the environmental conditions that are going to impact the ability of that crop to grow well and the ability of that crop to overcome competition and what the competition is. So, as all ecologists start any answer to any question, it depends. And so,
Right.
with that caveat, I'll just tell you what the systems that I have been involved with. On Carl's system, it was a really terrible soil, wooded, mostly wooded, and wooded that had been cut and it was in grazed meadow and not a very strong meadow, and that took a lot of off-farm compost to build up the soil, and a lot of water to grow the living mulches to then keep a living root in the soil at all times and to have residue added regularly. So with that kind of soil, he really needed the off-farm inputs to get to a place where we could then significantly reduce the off-farm inputs, which we did. And then at my farm, I started with low fertility pasture, and I could have probably done closer to what we did in Oregon, but I still think I would have needed to add maybe not compost to the whole field, but compost in the rows, in the crop rows. And then if you have what we had in Oregon, which was a basically high fertility mineral soil with good texture, good water, and a relatively good climate, that we could then really push the envelope and do the system that I just basically told you about. And that was, of course, to look at the pasture and say, okay, the soil fertility and this is pretty good. The soil organic matter is pretty good, but low. So we're going to add residues to build it up. We're going to take time. If you have a year to plan, that's wonderful. You can do almost anything. If you need to start making a living immediately, then you need to add some off-farm fertilizer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you're saying off-farm fertilizers, you're talking about composts and those sorts of things?
Right. So at Woodleaf Farm in California, it was the composted yard waste compost, which was a wonderful thing that was available in California because there were rules, regulations that all yard waste needed to be composted. It couldn't be thrown away. And so there was readily available cheap yard waste compost. Where I was in Montana, there were a lot of livestock producers, and so I could collect manure and I could bring it onto the farm, mix it with my materials, and make compost. So whatever is readily available to you for a compost to add, to do two things: to build up your soil organic matter and your carbon skeleton in the soil, and to feed your soil food web to get them going and active. Because in this kind of high residue farming, you can't do it without a healthy soil microbial community. So you move to a place, you've got mainly pasture, you do a soil test, you find out what the soil fertility is, you look at the depth and texture and quality of your soil, you figure out what your irrigation system is, and then you decide, number one question, how can I disturb the soil as little as possible? How can I design a system that keeps a growing root in the soil year-round? And so what I did, and what Carl did, was to have these living mulch row middles, and that way, even if my crops were annuals, and that we used tillage to incorporate weeds in the crop and some of the living mulch fertilizer, that some of that field had a growing root in the soil year-round. So those are my two big caveats to, and I'm going to add a third. So disturb the soil as little as possible for your climate, your soil conditions, and your financial situation, what kind of market you have and what kind of yields you need to be able to make a living at that market and be able to stay on the land. And then keep a growing root in the soil year-round and create habitat for beneficial insects as close to your crop as possible. We have, my husband and I actually came up with what we consider our 10 ecological principles, but those are the first 3 that I think are the most vital for then designing a system and going with it. And so that is how we did our system, with strip tilling into the 50-year-old pasture and adding living mulch from both sides of the row, and that's why we had the wider rows. We also had the 15-foot wide rows because our plan was to do a 15-year rotation with 5 years in one tilled bed, and then move over one 5-foot section and then seed that area that we've been tilling to clover. And by then, what we notice that happens is when you really crop an area, you utilize the nutrients and the clovers will grow really well. But when you build the soil up, what happens, I forgot to mention it, my system in biodesign in Montana, was that over time, I built the soil up by mowing the living mulches and leaving it in place and blowing it into the row middles, that the nitrogen levels and the phosphorus, but particularly nitrogen levels, went up, and the clover was no longer competitive with the grasses. So my beautiful field of solid clover by 2011 in Montana was a solid grass field. So those perennial living mulches had turned totally to grass. And that actually wasn't such a bad thing if you're becoming a carbon farmer. But over time, I think what we would have done is seed the crop row back to a clover and then do strip tillage after, say, 7 or 8 years to the row middles and trade back and forth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm wondering, you said that you've given us like 3 of your 7 ecological principles. Can you give us what those, or 3 of your 10, can you give us what the other 7 are?
I could if I had my computer up and running, which I don't. But what I would do would be glad to email you the 10. I could come up with them off the top of my head, but I have them written out so beautifully. Whenever we give presentations, we present them and we've worded them so well. I think that I'd love to email them to you, and because I'm also getting to be an old lady and I don't remember things as well as I used to.
No, that's great. If you've got them well worded, I'm not going to put you on the spot to do it. You can send those. If you want to send them, we'll put them up and let people see that.
Beautiful. I will email them to you, Jesse.
Well, Helen, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about this and giving me your thoughts and asking me your questions. Whenever people come and look at our systems or ask me questions, it helps me to see things in a different way and always helps me to understand things better. So I really appreciate that. I have one other thing to add. I'm in a position now that I don't know what the future of my farm is, and I am looking for people that might want to come and learn and help me on the farm. I have, as I said, a ridiculously huge amount of acreage and lots of equipment, and I have shown myself that I can run it by myself, but the yields on the orchards as the trees are getting bigger and bigger are going to increase, and it's going to get harder to do myself, doing all the harvesting myself. And we have a beautiful guest house where we had planned on teaching courses and having students come to stay on the farm for 5-day periods and do both a kind of an academic and hands-on classes. And because my husband never recovered from this accident, and I've lost him, I need some help. So if anybody is really interested in this kind of a system and wants to talk to me about it, I'd love to talk to them.
Yeah, that would be great, and we would be happy to advertise that for you. And it would be, I think, an honor for a lot of people to get that opportunity to work with you. So yeah, we'll definitely put that out there.
Well, that would be super, Jesse. I sure appreciate it.
Absolutely, and all of our condolences on your loss, and super honored that you're sharing all of this, and it's great to hear it, and thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I love this new farm. We designed this orchard to be everything that we had ever wanted to. Some of the peach crosses we made, and we collected apricot seed from all over the valley and our farm where all the wild apricots were growing, and planted them out. So we have this 300-foot row of wild apricots, and we want to see, if these will be more hardy and sturdy than the cultivated apricots that we've always grown. And we have this 600 tree orchard with 85 varieties, and I really would like to stay and taste all 85 of those new varieties and all the apricots that we collected and all the peach crosses. And so I hate to leave, but I think that unless I get some enthusiastic people to help me and be available on the place as well, I think I may have to go farm somewhere else rather than take on this huge place by myself.
Oh yeah, we would hate to see that happen, because now I want to taste those peaches and pears and so we gotta keep it going, because I've got to get out there and try them. All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Helen's work at woodleaffarm.org. We will also post that study that she spoke about at no-tillgrowers.com this week. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're getting it. Big thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help, and enormous thank you to my wife Hannah, especially this week with 2 kids, and I have been utterly useless. So she's amazing. Big thank you to Hannah. All right, and thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. And honestly, my podcast has not always been known for great sound quality. It's always been known for the quality of the content, not the quality of the of recording. So people have adjusted their expectations accordingly.
There you go.